kick straight off. I'm excited for today's topic. I really am. I can't wait to hear what Tim's got to say. No pressure. No pressure. Okay. So I'll do the introduction for anybody that hasn't been on one of these before, and then you know what it's all about. So hello, and a very warm welcome to this Explain Pain in the Clinic. My name is Joanna Taylor. I am Director of NOI in Europe, and I'm joined this morning by my very good friend and Principal NOI Instructor, Tim Beames. Morning, Tim.
Morning.
Fantastic. Tim has been a NOI teacher for over 15 years. He has taught literally hundreds of Explain Pain courses to thousands of clinicians all over the world. He is an active clinician himself, specializing in complex and persistent pain. He is also founder of an organization called Le Pub Scientifique, which is an online platform for clinicians to learn about the latest developments in clinical practice and pain research directly from the researchers and pain specialists. We will drop the link to that into the chat if anybody wants to go and take a look at that. Tim is also co-author of the GMI Handbook with David Butler and Lorimer Mosley. So these sessions are all about exploring how to practically use Explain Pain in the clinic. Some of you will have already done an Explain Pain course, so these sessions will reinforce and expand what you have already learned. And for some, if you haven't done an Explain Pain course, this can act as an introduction and get a feel for what it's all about. Just a couple of things to mention before we start. Tim will be talking for about 20 minutes. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat. We'll both be monitoring those. And if we get a lot of questions, we'll just get to as many as we can. And sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. If you want to watch the recording of this session, there are now two places where you can access the recording. One is in our fantastic NOI clinical discussion group, which I urge you to go and join. I will drop the link to that into the chat in a second. That is where we announce all of these live sessions. And also you will find in there David Bolton, who is in the audience, a NOI instructor and very experienced clinician, and also David Butler in there. They write fantastic content, clinical scenarios, patient stories, hints, tips, things to think about in your own clinic. There isn't always the time for them to answer individual questions about patients, but the content in there is superb. So I would urge you to go in there and have a look. And the second place where you can now view these, the recordings of these sessions is in YouTube. We've just created a NOI clinical discussion YouTube channel, and I will also drop the link to that. So please like and subscribe, and you'll be notified when we upload new sessions. We'll be uploading one a week, one of the one being the live, and then the week after, one of the previous sessions that we've recorded over the last 18 months. They are superb. So Tim, today we're going to be talking about acute to chronic pain. Why does acute pain develop into chronic pain and dipping into some neurobiology? So go.
Well, like, position ourselves quickly. For me, chronic pain is something that is persisting over a period of time. Typically, we think of that in time frames of 3 months. You often hear, don't you? But longer than you would have expected. And the other thing to sort of position ourselves here with, and I think might be helpful just when we're in the clinic, is to recognize that everybody that you meet will have experienced pain and recovered from it as well. So successfully recovered from it, got better and be fine, and most of the time just forgotten about it as well. So what we're really talking about now are often the periods that what brings someone to us as well in the clinic is that they might have gone through this process. So I feel like it's, I'm totally biased, but I feel like it's quite important to know it. And conceptually, if we then start just thinking about there being either protective or risk factors to someone moving from that acute to chronic, I hate the word chronic, by the way, but acute to chronic stage. And there seems to be protection in features of someone's resiliency. So that's quite a well-known feature that people explore, and they look at what helps to build resiliency in a person, and the risk factors really sort of bracket under the concept of vulnerability. And I think it's really like a question that I have in my head as I'm with my patients is really relating to that as well. So I'm trying to get to understand what is it at that moment in time that means that they might have been more vulnerable. So that would be my sort of sense making process. And then what I'm thinking is obviously moving back is a part of recovery, is how do we build back resiliency in people as well. So those features for me are sort of key, although they're sort of much bigger than we're going to talk about today, but I really feel that they're important. And then if we come down into this sort of idea of vulnerability, well, there's lots of different things that might mean that someone is more vulnerable. I mean, having poor health, for instance, struggling with your sleep, lacking sleep might mean that you're more vulnerable. Having a poor diet or being unable to have an appropriate diet, a lack of movement and exercise, in other words, inactivity. So they're all sort of lifestyle features that can feed into someone losing resiliency and being more vulnerable. And then there are obviously life experiences as well, and they might be early life experiences, they might be pre or intergenerational experiences, so what your parents and grandparents have gone through, that can lead to you being in a more vulnerable state. Being in a more vulnerable state doesn't necessarily mean, though, that you have to develop pain. It just means that you're more susceptible at that moment in time. So traumas like injuring yourself, having an operation, if you are in a more vulnerable state, might have some effect in the likelihood, at least, of you transitioning to chronic pain states. So understanding a little bit about that, I think is really helpful. And as you listen to someone's story and allow it to play out, you often do hear a number of traumas. There might be one big trauma that's really obvious. There might be a number of different things that are sort of simmering away in the background, and it's quite typical for you to hear that someone may have had surgery 6 months ago, and then a previous surgery 2 years ago, and you can't be certain, but there seems to be sufficient reason within that to suggest that is what is contributing to that state of vulnerability. So those are the sorts of things that we might be thinking about in the moment. How someone feels and thinks about what's going on as well. So if you hear something snap and you it can be quite terrifying, actually, can't it? So it's not surprising that your emotional state also feeds into that process of vulnerability in that moment in time.
Oh, okay, that's really that summarizes it really well. So do you want to start dipping your toe into the neurobiology around that now, or take it in a slightly different direction?
Yeah. Well, I thought I'd just dip toes in because
So what's going on, Tim, with all this stuff? What's going on in the body then?
Yeah, well, now let's sort of dip our toes in and look at two different levels, because there are different interconnecting levels of our biology that people can explore, from molecular all the way to behavioral levels, and it's very, very common in pain sciences for people to look more at the molecular and the cellular levels, and then part of that is just because of the predominance of a biomedical influence, and people looking for things that influence things at a molecular level, like pharmacology. So it's helpful for us to sort of position ourselves there. One area in particular that people put a lot of time and energy into making sense of is the synapses. So I wanted to, and it is only one level, but if we just look at the synapse we used to think of a synapse as one nerve communicating with another nerve. Now we know that it's much more complex, and at the very least we would consider the synapse being a tripartite synapse. In other words, there being 3 cells involved. So there will be a non-neuronal cell, a glial cell involved within that synapse, and having a really intimate influence on the strength of the communication between 2 nerve cells. And one of the features of injury is that people become more sensitive, and some of the reasoning behind that, or what we might think is appropriately the area that has been injured becomes sensitive, and it probably just cues us up to say, look, take care, protect, look after. Great prompts in that case, and it's really easy to take a little bit of weight off your leg, or just avoid certain movements to begin with, to allow the tissues to go through a healing process. And a part of that sensitizing process is that there is a strengthening of that communication. This neurobiological the mantra that people have in their mind is nerves that fire together wire together. Nerves that fire together wire together. And if you have some sensitization, the nerves are a little more excitable, they need less stimulus to fire off the electrical impulses and the chemical impulses. More of those going through that same pathway means that pathway can strengthen. So pathway strengthening is a part of the process of sensitization, and I know that's a good thing ordinarily, and it's a part of learning and memory, is that ability to be able to strengthen pathways, strengthen connections at a synaptic level. Hebbian learning, basically, who we're talking about. However, what we see is that under normal circumstances, that learning process, that strengthening process is totally appropriate, really helpful, and there is a predictable sort of turning on and up, and then turning off, down and off. And for some people, we talked about that vulnerable state there, and the phrase that I have in my mind is I'm thinking about what's the fuel for the fire. There's and coming back to those vulnerability states, maybe is the traumatic experiences, maybe is the fear and the worrying, the anxiety in the moment, that means that there's some sort of continual influence on the synapse. So maybe that's an influence from the top down. If we're thinking about anxiety, it might be influence at a local level. Perhaps there's some evidence of neuroinflammatory influences at a local level. That means the synapse remains in a more excitable state. And if you have excitability, normally it's sort of quick on and off, as we were saying. A word for that would be modulation. However, if that lasts for a longer period of time, we start to see modification at a synaptic level.
Right.
And now modification, I mean, this is plasticity, but plasticity that's longer lasting. So modification at a local level might include the change in expression of genes. In other words, the type of receptors and ion channels that are produced just slightly change. They change the responsivity. They maybe change the number, change the type that are being expressed at the synaptic level, and that's not just on the neurons, but it's on the glial cells as well. The types of neurotransmitters, peptides, etc., being released into the synapse might change as well. and a lot of I think a lot of emphasis went on that is that a lot of emphasis went on there being more pro-inflammatory mediators at the level of the synapse. Inflammation was seen as bad, um,
Yeah.
which we will come back to. But I think a more current understanding would be that the balance of pro versus anti-inflammatory or pro-excitable versus inhibitory mediators, neurokines as you might call them, shift and change. And some of the effects that can happen with that is that you can have things like a sort of excitotoxic events. You can actually have a cell death, too much of something. I always think of chocolate cake, because one piece of chocolate cake, fine, but if you were asked to eat the whole chocolate cake, then you like there's a sweet spot, isn't there? There's the right amount, and the same thing happens with these neurokines as well. So if you have too much of them, then you can start to have deleterious effects. You can have significantly bad things happen, like the cell death. So you can have loss of certain cells, and the loss of cells, a lot of the people have found is that the cells that seem to die off are the interneurons, and the interneurons have the modulating effect, and the modulating effect from the top down might be things like inhibition. So you lose your normal inhibitory effect at the level of the synapse, and that would be called disinhibition. So you not only have this ongoing excitable, everything's in a really ramped up state, but you also lose the ability to be able to dampen that down. So it's like your balance has gone. No longer have you got dampening effect, that's lost, and you've got lots more excitable effects. It's like woof, your balance has gone skewed, hasn't it?
I have to say, Tim, that is brilliant. I completely understand it.
Okay, brilliant. Well, that's what we want. Yeah, you're getting more bang for your buck then, aren't you?
That's absolutely brilliant. Sorry, guys, but I think that was a brilliant description of some. It felt like a little bit more than dipping your toe in, or is that just dipping your toe into the neurobiology, Tim?
That's just dipping your toe in.
Oh my god! Oh my god! You are good. You are good.
Well, I don't know about that, but it's
No, you are.
I find it's quite exciting, isn't it, to hear about some of that as well.
Very.
And there are other changes as well at the level of the synapses that if you have all this excitability, it can spread. And there are certain things like nitric oxide that actually diffuses across larger areas. So instead of there being the sort of simple excitability across one or several synapses, then you can actually start to have a spreading effect. So is a really common feature of pains that someone's pain can start fairly locally, and it can start to spread, and it can spread to other body parts. It can even spread to the opposite side as well. And I guess it would be helpful to then just talk about the role of inflammation, because there's different types of inflammation in the body. A normal inflammatory response from damaging your tissues. There's neurogenic inflammation, that is inflammation brought about by the signaling of a nerve, a particular type of nerve called a peptidergic nerve. And then there's another type of inflammation that comes about as a result of the activity of your glial cells. And we have different types of glial cells, Schwann cells, satellite cells in the central nervous system. We have astrocytes, microglia, and oligodendrocytes. And these are cells that are part of that tripartite and quadripartite synapse. So they're the other cells that are integral in that connective strength between the communication of one nerve and another nerve. And these cells are super interested. I mean, there's surveillance cells on one level and there's support and trophic cells on another. In other words, they keep their whole area healthy. But they also, oh, they can build up activity as well, and in fact they can have quite a interesting spread of effects, because where sensitization and this excitability used to, the people were really focusing their attention on just the area where you would expect connection to happen. So if, for instance, the receptive field in the spinal cord for the damaged tissue, people have started to explore away from that. So if you were to just look at the spinal cord as an example, if you looked on the contralateral side of the spinal cord, you see the similar changes occur on the contralateral side. So not on the area where the information flow is coming in, but on the opposite side. So the mirrored side. And then you start to see changes in neuroinflammation above, below that area, and also in a number of different cortical regions as well. So, coming back, I mean, that might just be a normal part of certain tissue injuries, particularly things like nerve injuries. Then we see very, very strong neuroinflammatory response. But they also are a part of stress responses, trauma responses as well. So where we would want inflammation, it signals the beginning of tissue repair and healing. There also look like there are the same responses are actually hindering our opportunities to go through that normal response and repair. So I think this is quite cool, but fairly recently people have been exploring actually what the gene expressions of inflammatory markers are, for instance. So, and what you see is, if you measure people over a really long period of time, there looks like there are fairly predictive features in the initial response that they have to injury. So where someone who recovers, it looks like they have a much stronger inflammatory response. And that response is a much more varied response as well. Whereas someone who looks like they are more likely to experience ongoing pain, they have a lack of response, of an inflammatory response. It's almost like they haven't turned on the signals that will eventually allow them to turn off that response. And we were just talking before we came on, weren't we? One of the things that people have explored, and there was a fairly new study looking at, and it was taking the UK Biobank of data, so it was looking at a massive amount of people's data, is that people who had taken NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, for pain in the acute stages were actually benefiting from an analgesic effect. In other words, it calmed, it dampened the excitability, but it almost doubled the risk of them proceeding to a persistent and ongoing, a chronic pain state. So there looks like there are sort of so it looks like there are, as I would say, sort of fairly standard practices for helping someone in pain in an acute state that might actually be giving us greater risk of persistent and chronic pain states into the future.
Can I just ask about that research, Tim? Was that use of those over a long period? What sort of period was it talking about?
Well, this is just in the acute stages. Yeah. So I believe it's like within the first couple of weeks. I'd have to go back and see whether they had that. But yeah, just in
that's insane, isn't it? Wow.
Yeah.
We've I know this is always happens. All the questions come right at the end, Tim. Kate
we haven't got to the second part. I was going to say let's look at things at a network level as well, but we've just been.
But have you seen the time? So I think we're going to maybe have to do a part 2 of this session, because it's absolutely fascinating. There's a few people here asking for the links to that research. Can we get that and put it in the show notes?
Yep.
Yeah, we'll Samantha and Sarah and for everybody else, we'll drop that link into the show notes after we've finished the session. Kate's come in with a couple of brilliant questions, but I fear that these questions we will probably come to in a different session. But her first question from Kate was, how do you distill this explanation into something that resonates with the person in pain?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that I'm talking to us as if we're really looking at neurobiology, and I don't go into that level with many of my patients. Some of them might do, and just it might come out in conversation, but the conceptual stuff I'm definitely going to be thinking about, and we talk about the iceberg, don't we? So it's important that you've got everything under the water in order so that you're able to, as Kate's saying, as so that you can distill it, and really what I'm distilling, how I'm distilling some of this knowledge are in story and metaphor and things that are more personal as well to them. In other words, the stories coming back, giving back their narrative. But some people benefit from hearing some of it, and the balance is a story that I talk about, and dampeners and calmers and things that excite and make things stronger. So I use maybe slightly different wording depending on the person as well, to give them that, to give them the message. Yeah,
I mean, I think what Tim's gone into today is very much part of an Explain Pain course, and the bigger question there about the language around explaining this to your patients is threaded throughout that course, of course, isn't it, Tim? And we've done sessions on that, so you can there are other sessions on that, but that may be something we'll do in the future. Tim, do you have anything that you just want to say before we wrap up? Because I am conscious of time. I know people are often on a time slot for these.
Well, look, I'm not a prescriber, so I've seen some of the other questions. I can't advise you about that, but I think it does bring into question our beliefs about inflammation. The positive protective role of inflammation, and encouraging a normal, healthy transition through that as well. And I would say it also, like, I would like people just to understand the vulnerable state as well, and recognizing that certain people in their life at certain times are in a more vulnerable state, and how can we support them?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. If you are interested in, Tim has just scratched the surface here today, but if you are interested in learning how this piece fits into the much broader picture of Explain Pain, and actually how you use this whilst working with your patients, then Tim has got Explain Pain courses coming up in all formats. So at the end of this month, on the 30th of September, he has got a live face-to-face 2-day Explain Pain course in London. Starting in October, I believe on the 12th, he has an online Explain Pain course, which is over 4 sessions. And then just in November, he will be starting his Explain Pain Winter School, which is an 8-week course, 2-hour sessions each week. All the sessions are recorded, so you can go back and review and re-listen and digest the more complicated parts of the experience. And in that 8-week course, you also get 8 weeks of mentoring with Tim. So that's a very comprehensive way to do Explain Pain. So if you're interested in any of those courses, all the details are on the NOI Group website. Jump on there, log your inquiry, and our course organizer, Nicola, will get back to you. So thank you very much for joining today. I was totally gripped. It was totally fascinating, Tim. Loved it. I think everybody in the audience has too. So thanks for joining live today. And as I said, the recording will be in YouTube. You'll be sent the link of where to watch it in YouTube. Please come and join the clinical discussion group. There's so much great stuff in there. And David Bolton's in there. He's just sharing his clinical experience in there. It's wonderful. So do jump on it and join that. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. So thanks again for joining, everybody. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.